Hello from the Delphi panel. I'm Kavounides, and I lead the Athens office of Boston Consulting Group. It's a great pleasure to be participating and discussing how environmental, societal, and corporate governance is reshaping investment decisions, but also corporate actions. With me today to discuss this very current topic is Nili Gilbert, Senior Advisor to BCG in Sustainable Finance and Investing, and a front-runner on the topic. Nili is the sitting chairwoman of two Rockefeller organization investment committees that are deeply committed to responsible investing. She's also a social mission board member for Seventh Generation, an advisor to World Economic Forum, Economic Club of New York, Council on Foreign Relations, Oxford University, the State of California, and Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. Nili, welcome to the Delphi Economic Forum. It's an honor to have you with us today. And I really hope next year we can have you here with us in person in Greece.
There's a lot of reasons I can't wait to visit Greece again. Thanks, Chrysos.
It'll be great to have you. In the last decade, we've seen sustainability and societal impact really rise to the top of the political and corporate agenda. Policymakers are introducing new standards, stepping up initiatives to drive sustainable investments. We're seeing new industrial alliances being formed to step up climate action. Just last week, we saw the announcements of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, for example. It's great to see the topic regain its momentum after the distraction of COVID. But it's not really new. We've had a lot of growing interest on green energy, on renewables, a lot of regulations coming in over the past decades. So ESG is now a prevalent term. Let's start at the very beginning. What is ESG and how is it different from all the discussions we've been having about sustainability and societal impact so far? Who should it really concern as a topic?
So it makes sense to start with broad brushstrokes on the theme of sustainability, because as you said, it includes corporate social responsibility, investment disciplines like ESG, but also impact investing, as well as a wide variety of public sector and NGO efforts. But the term ESG was actually coined by Forbes in 2005 to talk about the integration of environmental, social, and governance considerations in investment decisions specifically. And the reason that these were grouped together at the time is because they were all considered to be non-financial indicators as compared with things like revenues and cash flows. And now, over the years, the field has advanced from just negative screening, for example, excluding tobacco stocks from an investment portfolio, to deeper ESG integration, which recognizes that these indicators actually can be drivers of financial results. So as we start to become more sophisticated about this, investors are also starting to unpack those three broad pillars of E, S, and G to look at different companies in different ways, based upon the issues that make the most sense for each business, which we call materiality. And more recently, some governments, and especially the EU, have put finance at the center of their strategies for addressing long-term systemic issues like climate change. And when you think about it, this approach makes sense because finance touches everything else. I always like to think of it as being like the circulatory system for our economy. So when negative externalities like climate change and inequality are being consistently ignored or underpriced, that impacts the whole system, which is why regulatory efforts are now focused on getting the finance sector to internalize those externalities.
Okay, so to recap, it brings transparency to the impact that business actions and investments have on society and on sustainability. And I guess the implication is that investors will increasingly be looking at these aspects when assessing investment opportunities. And that makes the topic very real in financial terms for corporate leaders, for organizations. So what does that really mean in practice for a business? So why should ESG really interest a Greek corporate today?
Well, of course, Greek corporations should be asking the same key questions that we're hearing from leaders worldwide. How does ESG affect my business? How will it affect my funding and access to capital? How will it affect the way that investors are valuing our enterprise? And how will it help us to drive future success and avoid future risks? But I would also like to take a moment to point to some specific aspects about sustainability that focus on Greece. One key issue is about the physical risks of climate change and the way in which it could change certain parts of the Greek economy, so potentially increase inequality as well. When it comes to projected climate impacts, Greece is considered to become a water stress country in the future, which means projected reduction in rainfall. Actually, the water basins in the Mediterranean are expected to decline by more than 15% by 2050, even while they're rising in northern countries like the Netherlands. And the Mediterranean climate is also expected to get hotter. For example, in 2050, the French city of Marseille is expected to have temperatures more similar to what we see in Algiers right now. So this could obviously disrupt key sectors in Greece, like tourism, where Northern Europe starts to have the weather conditions that we see in Greece now, and of course, agriculture, which is so dependent on water and climate. In terms of social issues, this could be especially hard on workers in affected industries, but of course also for vulnerable people who tend to feel any contraction more deeply. So I think that Greek corporations may today start thinking about how to prepare for some of these changes. First of all, we all have to do what we can to slow down the climate problem by advancing net zero commitments, but also maybe start thinking about potential human effects like protection for outdoor workers in rising heat conditions, shoring up food system stability, maybe thinking about catastrophe insurance related to weather. Since investors, banks, and insurers will be thinking about this more and more, Greek businesses should also start taking action to mitigate potential future impacts on their own businesses.
So in effect, we're using the lever of financing, of insurance, of investors to force businesses to really think about the implications to their business beyond those financial terms, in terms of operational viability and operational risk in the long term, in effect, for those businesses and even more widely the sectors themselves. Nili, there's a danger sometimes with these things that they become a bit of a compliance exercise, a tick box effort to adhere to the regulation rather than make a real adjustment to the core business practices. Or, if we go to the extreme, we even see cases of potentially greenwashing, as we've seen in the media in the past. Do you think ESG can escape this? What are the key elements that both businesses themselves need to watch out for to avoid these pitfalls, but also investors are looking out for to detect those cases, if you like?
Well, in terms of mapping out the regulatory impacts, on the one hand, there are the near-term regulations, which we can see already passing or in the works. But we also have to project the impact of future regulations, which is probably even more important. One area that investors think about in this field is forecasting the impact of a fully priced global carbon tax. The United Nations Principle for Responsible Investing group says that there will be an inevitable policy response because the social cost of carbon emissions will eventually be so high that it can't be ignored. And when this happens, the risk repricing that will occur will be something that we call transition risk. And the longer that it takes for us to get to a global price on carbon, the sharper that transition risk will be. So one thing that companies can start thinking about now is how to protect themselves against that ongoing volatility. Some are already starting to internalize the price on carbon on their balance sheets. There's also the concern of physical risk, which we discussed, and then something that we call stranded asset risk, which speaks to assets that are currently being held at full value on companies' balance sheets, but that eventually may no longer be of use. Things like oil wells, oil reserves, coal burning utilities. And so some investors are doing the work now to reprice those assets on companies' balance sheets to mark them down in advance of becoming stranded. In addition to these concerns, you also have changes in consumer preference. It's not a regulatory change, but social acceptableness of certain practices is also going out of favor. And then the last thing I would say before turning to your question on greenwashing is that, of course, as business people, we can't only focus on the downside that will come from regulation. We also want to think about investing in the economy that is to come. So a lot of investors are starting to measure how companies are tracking on earning green revenues because they believe that this will be well rewarded by future regulation. They're also focusing on issues of how talent workforce training may drive business going forward. On the question that you asked about greenwashing, I just stopped to point out that the reason that greenwashing exists is because companies know that there is this upside potential from showing that you're green, and so they want to send those signals to the market. But unfortunately, of course, as we also know, there are several notable cases of deception that have happened in the past. Think of examples like Volkswagen, Eni, and others. But at the end of the day, I see this as a small sample compared to the companies that are really trying to do the right thing. And our biggest concern should be that the greenwashing or regulation that is excessive or faulty that's designed to prevent greenwashing could get in the way of a much needed and healthier focus on growth, experimentation, and innovation that will be needed to support this market growth and advance our common goals.
Very clear, very clear. And I guess reading between the lines from what you're saying is that while we talk about ESG investments today and the fact that there's an increasing demand for those and that demand is growing, and it's a hot topic, from Delphi today to Davos, reading between the lines, I guess ESG will stop being an ESG investment, right? It will overtake the so-called traditional investments, or they will converge. How do you see markets and investors making this shift? Because I guess the aim is for it to become the norm, right? To become the core mainstream for all businesses and how they think of their businesses and operations.
I believe that it will. The evidence is starting to build up. ESG investment performance over the past 5+ years has outperformed traditional investments. And in the COVID era, especially, we've seen another proof of concept for so-called stakeholder capitalism driving good business. And because of all the global risks that we've been discussing so far, we should also hope that the very strong trends in ESG and responsible investing will continue. The good returns aren't the only reason for us to want to see this advance. But really the reason that I expect for ESG as a separate discipline over time to disappear and just be folded in with the rest is because it's becoming recognized as a core part of what it means to analyze and run a business well. Paying attention to the social and environmental realities that our companies face and that will be driving our business results should become an indispensable part of what capital allocators and corporate leaders do. And of course, the most thoughtful business leaders will not only think about the ESG issues that are right on our own doorsteps, in our own inboxes, but as we become sophisticated, we should also start to probe the issue of what we call double materiality. Because the truth is, it's really not just the impacts that the ESG risks and opportunities that our own companies face that really matter to our success at the end of the day. It's the ways in which our companies and investment portfolios also affect the macro environment in which we're trying to operate. And so the better that we can understand the feedback loop that this creates and become increasingly willing to try to intervene at the systemic level, the better that we'll all be able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It becomes a virtuous circle. It's a win-win for all, and I think we're seeing also in all the research that we do this increasing correlation between societal impact and business performance and sustainability in business performance. And I think businesses have started to understand that this is a real value generator rather than a hurdle that they need to overcome. Looking at a lot of the corporate commitments that are coming out, particularly around sustainability more generally, Nili, on these very often extend for many years, 2035, 2040, 2050. Is there a danger of procrastinating and sort of kicking the problem down the road rather than getting to grips with it in the short term? And beyond the regulatory requirements, which are quite short term, how do businesses really make sure that they deal with this in the now, in the short term, and it doesn't become a problem for the next generation of leaders in an organization, which is a very easy thing to happen?
It's such an important question because the matter of time horizon is becoming a subject of critique and debate with some long-term ESG commitments. And also, I believe that when we still have debates about the impact of ESG on business results or on asset price performance, which we hear still a lot in the US more than Europe, I think that a lot of that also comes down to differences about time horizon. Because when you think about it, environmental, social, and governance issues, they do tend to drive performance over a longer term period. And so if you have an investor or a stakeholder who's really obsessed with just the next quarter's results, they may miss the value of these opportunities and then risk pushing things off too far into the future and missing the opportunity to drive long-term gains or to mitigate risks. But we also have to be aware that when it comes to making commitments that are very long term, like, for example, to get to net zero by 2050, the opposite is true. We have to be aware that we have to get started planning now. And so I believe that it's really important for companies and other leaders to make interim targets that are focused on what can be achieved in the near term to arrive at that long-term result. Essentially, using the long-term goal as an inspiration and guide to help inform short-term action.
Nili, thank you. Just to recap, I guess it's very real in financial terms, but also in terms of viability of businesses in the long term and their ability to continue operating normally. It needs to be embedded in their strategic decision thinking, and it's part of good governance to think about business risks, the implications to society, to their employees, to their community at large. Ultimately, it will become part of normal business operations, and it'll cease being a separate topic in itself. And I guess the key message is we need to start now and make sure it gets embedded over time so we can hit those long-term goals, particularly when it comes to environmental metrics. Nili, it's been a pleasure having you with us today. We really hope that we'll have you with us in person next year and have a much longer discussion with a large panel, and hopefully with the topic having matured even further and having some real positive examples to showcase. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much.